This is System Crash, a weekly tech news show willing to tell the hard truths about how tech and the titans who own and operate it is really transforming the world. I'm Paris Marks.
And I am Brian Merchant.
The one and only. And this week, we have a very special guest joining us, 404 Media co-founder Jason Koebler. Jason, welcome to the show officially.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Great. I love the show so far. Congrats on the launch.
Thank you.
Why, thank you, Jason. We have long been inspired by the work that 404 Media has been doing on and off the air, in the blogosphere, in the digital media minds, and over the airwaves on YouTube. It's a good podcast, too. In fact, I find the podcast is a good way to just kind of get your digest of all of the 404 Media news stories that you may have missed on the feed.
Yeah, please listen to the pod because it's the hardest to get anyone to sort of like go and do.
I really enjoy the 404 podcast. Like, as Brian was saying, to kind of get like the recap of what was going on and get some of like the behind the scenes stuff of, you know, what you guys have been working on. I find it fascinating.
It is one of 7 podcasts that we officially recommend, and our recommendation does not come easy. You have to pass a rigorous battery of tests and standards before making it on that recommendation list, and 404 Media made it. Just barely, but eked across the finish line.
I appreciate that.
And Jason, thanks also for joining us. Jason and I, we fled the fires together and saw each other in San Diego a little bit. And now we're both getting sick together. Hope it's not COVID. So, well,
yeah, I guess that's the update on last week, because we recorded last week and we were like, Brian's okay. He's not had to go anywhere. And like that evening, was it? Or the next day or something? It was like, yeah, I'm gone.
Same day, we left. They closed the schools, LAUSD, and the air quality was garbage. So we were just, we live about 10 minutes drive from where the fires were at the time. I think they've since moved like northeast. So yeah, we bailed and stayed at the in-laws for a little bit, who we were fortunate to have in-laws close by. And yeah, there was a lot of people who did that, understandably so. The air quality alone, right, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I was texting you, we live close by, and Brian was like ambivalent about leaving or not. And I had left earlier in the day because the smoke was just hovering over my house for 2 days. And Brian was like, yeah, we might leave for logistical reasons relating to the kids. But I was like, logistical reasons such as you cannot breathe, like because of toxic air.
Yeah, that's a good logistical reason. Yeah.
We had a weird thing where like there's like this band of like the wind was just blowing in just the right direction for half the day or so. And it was just like this weird like bubble of blue sky. It was almost like we were like under the dome or something in that Stephen King, but where like it was all happening outside. So we could like the skies were cloudy and it looked ominous and apocalyptic. But like right where we were like, well, it's not. And then like the winds changed and then it's just like unbreathable.
So wild. Meanwhile, we got snow yesterday. So
it's snowing up in Canada. Yeah, we've talked about this before. Like on our entire continent, we're like southwest, right by the coast, and you are the furthest like northeast tip, hanging off in there.
Probably 20-ish kilometers from where I am. There's like literally a signpost that's like the furthest east you can go in North America is right here.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's really
They're
funny.
like, you are as far from Brian Merchant as you can possibly get continental North America.
That's why I'm here. Yeah. Unless we don't count Greenland, right? If you guys buy it, then it changes.
Yeah, we have the purchase pending. Yeah, but we haven't disclosed this yet. But we wanted to encompass as much of North America as possible. So it's a strategic positioning to make sure that we are reflecting the maximum sort of landscape of all North American citizens. So you're welcome for that.
East and West Coast, got to represent, right?
Yeah.
Plus North and South, Canada, US, we got it all.
There's so much to talk about today. We are going to mostly be focusing in on the ongoing Mark Zuckerberg and Meta saga, because that story just keeps sort of revealing new horrors every couple days, many of them exposed by 404 Media, which is why we wanted to have Jason on the show today, because 404, and I think, Jason, are you writing most of those stories? I know Joseph has something coming?
I
And
mean, I've
yeah.
written a lot. I wrote a lot about Meta last week. A lot, a lot, a lot. There's been a few others as well.
I just feel we're lucky we can have this conversation because Mark Zuckerberg saved free speech for us.
Yeah, last
So
week he saved free speech and lifted the veil of censorship, except for he's blocking 404 Media.
yeah, yeah.
It's funny. It's so funny. It's like a few of our articles were getting instantly deleted on Facebook, and my account was getting, like dinged with little strikes, as they call them. So I was like unable to join groups for a few weeks, which is, I don't use Facebook except for reporting, so I couldn't join it. But then, we wrote an article about how Meta was deleting these posts that we were doing that were about Meta deleting posts from a trans influencer on Instagram. And then the article that we wrote about Meta censoring that article was also deleted. So good stuff.
Was that only on the Facebook platform or also on like Instagram and Threads?
It's interesting that it's been a little bit different because Facebook, yes, everything's been getting deleted off of Facebook, but some of them have not been getting deleted off of Threads. But then some of them have been getting deleted when we link to them on Instagram. So I'm not
Interesting.
exactly sure how the content moderation system works at this exact moment, even though I've reported a lot on how Meta's content moderation platforms work, but there's been so many changes recently that who knows how much those ecosystems are interacting at the moment.
It's a new opportunity to poke a prod and see what has changed.
I mean, they've changed it continuously over the years, mostly with an eye towards trying to spend the least amount of human labor costs that necessary that they have to do. They all want to have automated. I mean, they do have hundreds of millions of billions of users that these systems need to monitor. So at the current scale, at the current construction, you couldn't really employ people to do that. And now this is just just kind of like a gift, right? From the cultural winds have blown this way. So, now they get to sort of shepherd it in under like a cultural crusade, and they get to cut costs at the same time. But I wanted to start out by saying, like, sort of, the Meta news saga is big right now, but there's also the other major news is probably the TikTok ban, getting heard in the Supreme Court and those final arguments sort of going through. We talked about that, I think, in episode 3 or 4. We kind of drilled down into what we think is really going on there. But regardless of the reasons that this ban has been pushed to the point that it has, it's wound up before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, I think the general consensus is that it seems unlikely that they're going to stop this ban from taking place. So the ban, as of right now, seems likely. The implementation of that ban remains a question, and what Trump will do with regards to implementing that ban when he takes office, or how it will be handled, all of the logistics, all those matters, is still up in the air.
And also how TikTok and ByteDance will actually respond, right? Because we've had conflicting stories about that this week too.
Right.
Some suggesting that China is looking to Elon Musk as like this kind of broker to find some deal to sell TikTok's US operations to some US entity so that it can continue operating. But then on the other hand, TikTok itself saying that's absolutely not happening. We're just shutting down if the ban goes through.
Yeah, and I think part of it is that ByteDance has an interest in playing its cards close to the chest, right? It can say or have no comment about whether or not it's going to offer a sale with the aim of sort of maximizing value. If it looks like it is being forced to sell, it could cost it billions of dollars. So, yeah, really interesting sort of nebulous moment of which we'll only know for sure the outcome of which will be, next week and the weeks that follow. But I do think that there's an interesting undercurrent here, and that it connects to our main sort of story of the week, which is the ongoing Meta saga. And that's that I think it hasn't been discussed quite as much, that all of this sort of interest that Mark Zuckerberg has in sort of reorienting the company culture, making all of these sort of policy changes in the direction of Trump. I think most people have really glommed onto the fact that, like Trump was elected. Mark Zuckerberg, is on record thinking Trump is a badass, even though Trump wants to throw him in jail, or did at one point. So there's the element of sort of like, just kowtowing to a new political regime. But there's also, right, like the fact that TikTok is one of, if not the biggest competitor to Meta's products, right? It's a huge upstart. And so at the same time that Mark Zuckerberg has been going on Joe Rogan, doing away with its DEI program, firing content moderators and fact checkers, he's also been visiting Mar-a-Lago and really sort of cozying up to Trump himself, perhaps for just cold, calculated business reasons of trying to maybe grease the wheels toward, Trump has been on the record saying he could go either way with the TikTok. He's like, I like TikTok now. I think it was his most recent statement. He started out wanting to ban it, then came around, and now is like kind of sort of soft positioning him as a champion of TikTok.
Yeah, I mean, so I really think that the stars are aligning for Mark Zuckerberg here. Like, I think you have to look at the entire context that you just laid out, and I think that it may be one of those correlation versus causation type situations where we cannot say for sure that Meta is changing all of its policies to be more magnified to push through a TikTok ban. However, it's like all of these like strategies and situation and changes very much align with that. And I'm working on a story now. Hopefully it'll be up by the time you're listening to this, but there's been like conflicting reporting on whether Meta itself has lobbied for the ban. Back in 2022, the Washington Post reported that this firm called Targeted Victory was hired by Facebook to push for a TikTok ban. At the same time, Meta has said, like, we haven't pushed for a ban. Meanwhile, Meta has spent record amounts lobbying Congress in 2024. But this like led me, like I had this moment where I remembered watching Zuckerberg get hauled in front of Congress in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. And those were over a variety of different things. There was like Cambridge Analytica scandal. There was a bigger hearing about like tech monopoly power in general, so on and so forth. And the undercurrent of all of Zuckerberg's pushback to Congress when they said, what about user privacy? What about competition? So on and so forth. He said over and over again, we face competition from China. We face competition from China. And if you regulate us in any way, that is going to allow China to win, and it's going to allow the Chinese government to win. He did this big speech at Georgetown University about a week before he was pulled in front of Congress. I believe back in 2017. I just had it up a few minutes ago. But he said, quote, until recently, the internet in almost every country outside of China has been defined by American platforms with free expression values. But there's no guarantee that those values will win out. A decade ago, almost all of the major internet platforms were American. Today, 6 of the top 10 are Chinese, and we're beginning to see this in social media too. He then goes on to talk about WhatsApp, and then he specifically says, on TikTok, the Chinese app growing quickly around the world, mentions of protests are censored even here in the US. I just think that Zuckerberg, I can't stand him, and he's like run his platforms into the ground, but he's not dumb. And I think that he sees the sort of like political winds changing in the United States, and he sees the finish line where TikTok, the one platform that is eating Instagram's lunch, whose product is far better than Reels, that has really like this cultural cachet that Facebook once had and no longer has. He's so close. The ban is almost here. And the only thing standing in the way is Trump deciding that he likes TikTok suddenly because he like went on Theo Vaughn's podcast and had an enjoyable time. Like something like this, some machination like that. And so, I mean, I really think it's like you have him now groveling to Trump. And I think that there's probably some part of this where he's like, if I get close enough to Trump, I can push this ban over. And then we will have no competition in this space.
You can really see like the kind of warring views there. And just to say, I looked up the Georgetown speech was 2019, just to be clear for the listeners. But it's like, you have Zuckerberg, who is really in for this TikTok ban, right? Because it would really benefit Facebook and Meta and ensure that these platforms are protected from this major competitor. But then on the other hand, you have like Trump, who is warming to not having this ban. You have, this talk of Elon Musk apparently being open to not banning it or saying that he doesn't want to ban. And so it's like a lot of these players in the Trump orbit are going against this goal that he really wants to see move forward. Yet, like, it's basically gonna happen. The question is just, does it stick, or does it then get reversed like a few days later or a few weeks later or something like that? I wonder, Jason, feel free to comment on that. But also, when you were going back over and looking through these like speeches and things that Zuckerberg was giving in these testimonies to Congress, did you see this like narrative about China escalate like over those years? Like, did it become something that became more prominent as the years went on, as it became clear that this was like a good approach to take in defending essentially the interests of Meta's platforms, as I guess US political tides started to shift, and as there was more and more talk of like regulating American social media platforms in particular?
That's really interesting. I actually believe it de-escalated a little bit, and I have a theory for why this is the case. Zuckerberg was very strong in his sort of like anti-China rhetoric in 2019, 2020, and then notably extremely anti-China in this 7-hour congressional hearing about Libra, which was the cryptocurrency platform that Facebook was trying to launch. Which,
man.
very quick aside, on Joe Rogan last week, he was like, why was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau looking at us, a social media platform? We have nothing to do with money. Meanwhile, they tried to launch an entire version of money. And that in this platform, he was positioning Facebook as, he was like, it is either Libra or it is Xi Jinping is going to launch a competitor to this, and China will dominate the international economy. So, I mean, the cynicism associated here is just like mind-boggling.
Yeah, he just lied over and over
yeah.
in that. I think people don't even realize. I mean, we talk about the content of like, and the sort of like the cultural sort of positioning, and how he's sitting there with his like gold chain and his, talking to Joe Rogan about, why woke is bad or whatever. But like, yeah, that's a great example. For one thing, like, nobody who remembers Libra, like, he's able to just do these things. Facebook has gotten into so many different sort of industries and like corners of the industry over the years. It's bought up competitors, and it just does it all. And it knows that people can't really keep track at home of this scorecard, all the things that Facebook is responsible for doing, that Meta is responsible for, and the decisions that it's made. And he can just basically lie through his teeth.
He is there groveling in 2020 during the anti-monopoly hearings, which happened during the Trump administration, first of all,
Right.
and happened during COVID. He is there groveling, saying, we are fighting COVID misinformation. We are fighting election disinformation. This is very, very important to us that we not have COVID misinformation on our platforms. And he calls for regulation. He says, please regulate us, regulation that we write and capture. And then on Rogan, he's like, the Biden administration like called us and yelled at us.
Yelled at us.
And
Yeah.
it's like you are changing your story constantly. There's live streams of it. You can go and watch it. They're very long. So, not that many people have gone back and watched.
It's Musk Trumpism. He knows that he can just say it, and with enough, emphasis, and that he won't be questioned, that it will just enter the record as such. He's learned his lesson too, as many of these guys have from Musk and from Trump especially, that truth is secondary, that journalism exists kind of as a scapegoat for him, nothing else, right? And that's why all this is happening, because what we really wanted to do was be Trumpist the whole time. Again, as Jason just pointed out, never mind if that didn't align with what actually happened. He's neatly sort of retconning the entire sort of narrative. And also, it's just so funny that he's just like freeing his own company from censorship that he imposed. I wrote an article, one of my columns at the LA Times was about how even in the realm of, tech titans and the owners of these social media platforms, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg are kind of stand alone in the sort of amount of obscene control he has. Just the way that like Peter Thiel, a name that should, funny enough, keeps coming up. He helped Mark Zuckerberg structure the company in such a way that he was basically immune from any threat by the board. And so some companies, they have to listen to their boards. They even them, super well paid.
He kind of brags about that in the Rogan interview too. Yeah.
Yeah, he does. So he's like basically a little despot. He's a social media authoritarian in the truest sense. It's not like Musk also has a private company and can do whatever the hell he wants at X.
And SpaceX.
Yeah, at SpaceX too. But Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, he has this like totalizing control over it, which is why it's also just pathetic, right?
Yeah, all the like wokeism and blah blah blah, like the kowtowing, like this all happened to him. Like these were proactive decisions at every single juncture.
There's this hilarious segment in the interview where Rogan starts going on about how Twitter banned Trump, and it was like this crazy active censorship. And he can't believe how like a platform was able to get away with this. Meanwhile, Zuckerberg is sitting there silent because they also banned Trump, but he like never says it or breaks it up.
I was waiting for him to say something and he doesn't say anything, or Rogan to like, God forbid, do his research. No, I was just going to say that I think that as TikTok really rose to prominence and as antitrust scrutiny increased on Meta, like actual, Lena Khans of the world, doing more than just sort of rattling cage about this. I think that he probably realized that specifically going to war publicly with TikTok would have the reverse impact of what he wanted. And so I feel like he did almost dial down the rhetoric once, a lot of Congress members started kind of taking up that cause for him, more or less.
Do you think that more comes from like he doesn't need to say it as much publicly, but as you mentioned, like Meta is spending more and more on lobbying, potentially pushing those messages in other ways so that you start to hear it much more from people in Congress rather than him having to come out and say it himself all the time?
I think that's what's happening. I don't have any specific reporting to that, but that makes sense to me. I think that's what happened. And then also, I think it's like if he publicly goes to war with TikTok, you can point to that and say, like, you're a monopolist. And they were maybe not able to do that as much because he kind of shut up about it.
And it probably doesn't work for the cause because so many people hate Mark Zuckerberg, or at least did up until his like MMA rebrand quite recently.
Yeah. I mean, it's also interesting and something I also don't hear discussed as much, but this is what it takes, for there to be a competitor to one of Meta's platforms now. It has to be based in another country, right? Where Meta or Google or one of the giants now or Elon Musk can't just buy it up, kind of stuff it into a corner of its pipeline or shut it down or just turn it into a rebranded service. It has to be owned by a foreign country. It has to be resistant to sort of acquisition.
And a foreign country that's willing to like keep out the American competition so that it can actually grow for a while, right? Like you won't really see a European competitor because Facebook and Twitter and stuff dominate over there. So they can't really build their own.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm very interested in, Instagram competitors on the Fediverse and decentralized, AT protocol, things like that, just because Blue Sky was able to take the anti-Musk sentiment and has really built an actual user base there. And it's like it pales in comparison to the scale of even X or even of, any of Meta's platforms. But there are decentralized alternatives to Instagram. It's just that they're very, very tiny. And I think that at this point, you probably have to piggyback on the success of something like Blue Sky, or you need, frankly, like a Chinese company to do it.
So you'll be a day one sign up for Flashes, Blue Sky's new photo sharing app. And of course, you're already on RedNote, the TikTok competitor that everyone's going to now that it's apparently being banned, right?
But we still see, even in that, what you just mentioned, Jason, is I think the last story that 404 ran about this was about how Meta and its platforms are blocking links to, what is it?
Pixel
Fed, that's right. A competitor to Instagram, which is attempting to sort of capitalize on sort of the outrage at Meta in the similar way that Blue Sky did. And just like, X throttled links to Substack, it throttled links to Blue Sky. Is Meta being even more aggressive in like literally just sort of like banning those links, or what's going on there?
Yeah, so Pixel Fed is an upstart federated competitor to Instagram. That said, it doesn't even have an iPhone app yet. For example, it's tiny. Yeah. They're launching an iPhone app this week, an iOS app. It has an Android app, but basically any link that went to pixelfed.social, which is the main sort of server for that, was getting deleted immediately as spam.
They just don't want any interest snowballing at all. They're trying to cut it off at the root, do you think?
I mean, possibly, or their spam filters are just broken. And I think it sort of doesn't matter whether it was intentional or whether their, content moderation filters are broken, because the effect is the same, that they're not allowing people to share this information. But when you talk about content moderation, it's like Meta has been all over the place on so many different things, whether that be adult performers, LGBTQ people on, Instagram and Facebook, things like Palestine protests, that there is enough confusion about what the rules are and how they are enforced. And the new changes that Meta has made that are allowing like very specific types of anti-LGBTQ hate and dehumanization, and being able to say like a trans person is mentally ill despite there being no scientific basis for that. It's like the specificity is the cruelty, and in that, and the cruelty is the point, I think. But at the same time, it's not like these platforms were good for these communities for a long time, because the enforcement was all over the place. Meta has had round after round after round of layoffs affecting these teams. So for me, I really do feel like all of it is just a very public kissing of the ring for Trump. And I think the actual impact on these platforms is kind of like to be determined, because they're quite bad already.
That's a good point. Just to like hammer home again, and this is a complaint that a lot of people have had, and why there's been so much interest in antitrust for like the last decade, is that we're seeing on like both ends, right, of how, these tech companies at this size, the tech giants like Meta, maintain their power. There's no other way to describe it but anti-competitive, right? On the one end, they're working the courts and lobbying for like an actual legislated ban of a competing app that is used by hundreds of millions of Americans. So that's one tool, one cudgel. And the other, they're actually just making use of this suite of tools on their platforms, technical tools, to ban links, to throttle this. It's just, these tech companies, which were once supposed to be these sort of the height of like American entrepreneurialism and innovation, are now just like, it's nakedly monopolistic behavior. And this is how they compete in the marketplace now, through the courts, by making their platforms worse, by enshittifying, by punishing users who flee, and then just doing all they can to build moats. I hope people are looking at that as they watch all this unfold, and just recognizing like, what the state of the internet is thanks to these companies, and how they protect their interests. So
yeah, I think that's a really important point. And then, of course, looking at how, they're not only trying to stifle legislation and regulation in the United States, but like we've talked about, last week and in previous weeks, one of Zuckerberg's explicit pitches, including on Rogan, was we need the US government to defend American tech companies abroad and make sure that they're not being regulated by like the EU and places like that. But Jason, I wanted to come back to something that you were saying there, right? Because 404 has been doing a lot of reporting on how quickly Meta has started to like rein in diversity policies and things that were there to like, make LGBTQ people, trans people feel welcome on these platforms. They took out these messenger themes for trans and non-binary people, like, just a very small thing to allow these people to like theme their messenger app in a certain way.
Right. It's small, but it's like, why do that? You're taking away an option. It's punitive. It's like, it's basically saying, fuck you. It's like, it is a fuck you. I don't think there's any other way to read that. I mean, the other stuff, they can make a case. They're like, oh, well, we're loosening the restrictions on speech or whatever. I don't buy it, but like, this is what like really pushed it a step beyond. We're like, we're actively going to take back things that we had done before to try to make you feel better.
You're talking about like the broader pullback on these diversity initiatives. You've been reporting on how employees are pushing back against that. And when I was reading it, I was thinking about this story that was published in the New York Times back in September. It was a poorly titled piece that suggested Zuckerberg was done with politics and all this stuff. But they were explaining how like Zuckerberg himself got fed up with this kind of progressive pushback and progressive criticism that he was receiving at the philanthropic organization that he runs with his wife, Priscilla Chan, and just more generally, like at Meta, that they weren't doing enough in response to the murder of George Floyd, that they weren't doing enough in response to the kind of rollback of abortion rights in the United States by the Supreme Court. And of course, this suggestion that they see pro-Palestine campus protests as anti-Semitic and very against that as like a form of far left progressivism. I wonder if you have any suggestion of what these changes suggest to us about where Mark Zuckerberg is politically these days, if we have any real insight into that, or if these are just like politically opportunist things that he's doing to show that he's on side with these conservatives so that, as you're saying, he can try to get a TikTok ban and these other sorts of things that he wants.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that a lot of what I'm reading right now is like Mark Zuckerberg has changed his politics over the last few years, or other people are saying Mark Zuckerberg was always like this. And I have been covering Mark Zuckerberg for so long. I really do just believe the only thing that he cares about is Facebook's power, Meta's power, and sort of like aligning with the shifting political winds at any given moment. And that was even more clear as I went back and I started watching some of these older speeches, like being hauled in front of Congress, because I don't think he's a great communicator. And I definitely don't think he's a very authentic person, but he is very good at groveling in a specific way that makes it feel like, yeah, he actually is trying to stop fake news on his platform because he cares about democracy and so on and so forth. Like, after the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the sort of fake news bonanza that was 2016. And then the way that he's been able to sort of like retcon that in his head and publicly, he now seems like a true MAGA believer. And I just don't think that that's the case. I think that he is a billionaire, a mega, 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 mega billionaire.
I think third richest person in the world right now as it stands. Yeah.
Yeah. Is like a pretty good political operator who had a really good idea for Facebook and has since not been able to actually innovate in any real capacity other than buying other successful companies with the largesse and power of his own company. And then launching like really ill-fated things in the meantime. It's like the metaverse, a disaster, Libra, a disaster.
What? We're recording this in the metaverse. What are you talking
yeah,
about?
exactly. But I think the one thing that he's been very good at is using political power to sort of entrench Meta's larger space in Silicon Valley and really saying that like Meta is America, like to these politicians. He's been able to say, like on Rogan, he said the US government should be a shield for Silicon Valley, not the tip of the spear attacking us, so on and so forth. And I really don't think that his politics have changed. I think that this has always been his MO. I think that what we're seeing right now, this kind of like blitz of policy changes, of PR rollout, going on Rogan, taking the tampons out of the men's bathrooms, the destroying of the trans messenger themes, like getting rid of fact checking, all of this happening in like a 1 week period. It's just a very public, like, old Facebook is done. Here's new Meta. We're Meta for Trump now. And I have an easy time squaring that in my head because I think that he's a very political operator who believes in nothing.
Right. He's very shallow. It's very shallow. It's very chameleonic. And that's, I feel like, what he's always been. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think, in fact, like, he got a lot of flack when he first came up like 2 decades ago as being kind of a sort of feckless nerd type without any social skills. But that has almost kind of like worked to his benefit, maybe, as it has for a lot of Silicon Valley guys who then, sort of the most minimal gestures towards a subculture or towards a politics then becomes sort of a story. As you mentioned earlier, Paris, like all he had to do was like get a fashion designer to make a cool sweater for him and to put a chain on, and he ruffled up his hair, and that was good for like a month's worth of stories.
I do think he likes MMA
I
though.
do.
I think he's a big fan. I think he's enjoying that.
I'm sure he likes that too.
But it's like that doesn't mean he's changed and we need to treat him like he's some totally different kind of person, right?
Seeing the chatter online about the Rogan interview, I was like, man, he's really gonna like let loose in this thing, and all these grievances he's bottled up. It's the same old sort of, stilted, sort of vacant-eyed Zuckerberg.
Even when they talked about MMA, it was mainly like Rogan, like just going on and on,
Yeah. And he's just sort of doing his gestures. Jason, as you're saying, he's just sort of like, he's playing the part as he needs to. And I don't, I feel like I feel like this one does feel particularly, kind of good to him in certain ways, because it vindicates some of the grievances that he's no doubt had over the last few years, having been something of a pariah in the press. Like Facebook really got singled out for being the primary source of like disinformation or whatever around the first Trump election, and he got dragged before a bunch of hearings, and I'm sure that pissed him off, on a personal level. And so like from that to just sort of like going on Rogan is like an easy enough step. But yeah, I think it serves his interest, it serves his empire, and that's like ultimately what he's after more than anything else.
I will say, I think that the ending of like diversity hiring practices, the sort of like public, we're going to allow people to speculate about like trans people having mental illness, things like that.
We need Meta to have a more masculine energy now.
Yes, all of this. I think that it's obviously not just Facebook, it's not just Mark Zuckerberg, it's not just Silicon Valley even, but I think that the downturn in the economy has allowed these tech platforms, which in the past had to compete really hard for software engineers, for labor. They had really given up a fair bit of power to their employees. We saw internal and external protests at Google kill, a Chinese search engine. We saw, a lot of different employee protests against sexual harassment, things like this, which sort of led a lot of Silicon Valley to say, okay, we care about diversity, we care about employee rights. We saw sort of a nascent labor movement and unionization movement. And then there's a downturn in the economy, there's mass layoffs, there's this situation where these tech companies are trying to shed payroll, they're trying to get rid of employees, and they are no longer scared of pissing off their employees. And, Zuckerberg saying like, we need more masculine energy, all this, like maybe it will drive out the queer employees at Meta, maybe the ones that still exist, the ones that are still protesting internally. Right. But the job market is not such anymore that people can leave Meta making $400,000 and go join Amazon making $500,000 next week.
Yep.
And so I think that they have really been able to crush employee power, employee backlash, because of the way that the broader tech economy has gone. And I think we saw like Brian Armstrong at Coinbase, the CEO of Coinbase, say like, no politics here. And the effect of that was like a lot of people left the company, and you sort of see like Silicon Valley CEOs and VCs, spiking the football and really like gleefully talking about, well, like if you do these policies, your trans employees will leave. And the response has been good. We don't care.
Yeah.
And that's really chilling. It's really scary.
It does seem like Apple is like one of the only big ones that seems to be really pushing back against that, or like not kind of joining the chorus there. Yeah, Tim Cook is like still trying to cozy up to Trump and make sure he, ensures that the EU is not going to be going after Apple as much. But it does feel like he has been pushing back on this like anti-DEI, movement that has been happening. It seems like the one notable one, I guess, not to like heap praise on Apple or anything.
No, I think it's worth saying because it is, and it also might be kind of his own savvy calculation, or Tim Cook is a gay man himself.
That doesn't stop Peter Thiel. Yeah,
that's true, but it is different. But he might also say like, this is just kind of just hungrily sort of adopting the policies or the politics of a new administration and driving out people that might other be good, long-term sort of contributors to the company might just be a short-sighted move, and Tim Cook might be keeping an eye on that. But I do think what Jason was talking about is the predominant trend right now, because especially preceding the election, even with all the protesters getting fired for speaking up about Gaza or speaking up about selling tech to Israel, and even beyond that, I do feel like that the needle really did move against employees on a lot of fronts. The other sort of semi-notable exception, Microsoft is a little more all over the place, because they did fire people for protesting Microsoft's involvement in building tech for Israel, and yet they entered into this sort of awkward agreement with, I believe it was the AFL-CIO, to sort of not meddle in unions that might want to organize at Microsoft or their subsidiaries. So there was at least a fig leaf of sort of, but that also might have been tied to trying to curry favor for the big acquisition of Activision. So who knows? There's a lot going on, but by and large, the trend is the one I think that Jason pinpointed. Google especially has been surprising to me, where it used to be this place with aspirations of, building a more progressive future, and now they're just increasingly just punitive with employees that speak up. You want to go, fine, you're out. Or you speak up here, you have a little sit in at your desk, you're fired. It is a lot harsher. And I think by and large, that's what's happening in Silicon Valley right now.
Sundar Pichai essentially said, cut the shit, right? There was a moment where he's just no more.
It's so wild.
It is wild. We've witnessed sort of the logical evolution of these tech companies, capture large markets, stifle the competition in the ways that we discussed earlier in the episode, rise to power, and then not really need those engineers anymore. Once you're a market dominating a monopoly, then you have the power to do things like that. And with at least 4 more years of it, antitrust is pretty much DOA, I think. I don't know. There's some weird pro antitrust wins in certain corners of the Trump administration, but I don't think they're going to be the power brokers there. But we're dealing with a Silicon Valley that has aspirations of oligarchy, that is comfortable wielding this power in increasingly blunt ways, and Mark Zuckerberg's sort of open and naked embrace of this ethos, even if it's not really changing its business operations as deeply as we might think, is a good indicator of that.
But hey, this embrace of Trump and the MAGA movement is also going to get us a $40 million Melania Trump documentary. So, we can't complain about everything.
Worth every penny.
But I did want to add one more piece to the story before we pivot to our final wrap up that we go through. It's kind of I guess, building on something that we were talking about more last week, the bigger changes to Meta's policies, getting rid of fact checkers, all this kind of stuff. The Brazilian government was very quick to kind of hit back at Meta about this once Mark Zuckerberg announced these changes, wanting a response from Meta within 72 hours, I believe it was, to know what effect this is going to have in Brazil. And Meta essentially sent a letter to the Brazilian government saying that these changes were only going to apply to the United States for now, not to other countries. So I think it remains to be seen how this is going to play out globally. I've seen some people commenting that, well, some of this stuff, a lot of the resources for this stuff aren't dedicated to a lot of countries around the world anyway, so it doesn't make much of a big difference. But I think that that's one aspect of this that we'll have to watch to see to what degree that actually holds true. If this stuff does end up being rolled out globally, just, much more quietly than it was in the United States, where you want Donald Trump to know that, and the conservative movement more broadly, that Meta is aligning with them. So yeah, I think that'll be interesting to see.
Brazil has been protecting the entire internet over the last few weeks.
Good job, Brazil. Thank you.
You're absolutely right, though. I have done extensive reporting on how Meta's, content moderation policies actually work. And, Meta is very quick to say that they have 2 billion users, 3 billion users, and they have users all over the world. And over the years, they've done a really, really horrible job of moderating content that is not in English. I mean, most notoriously with the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, where they're credibly accused of helping to facilitate a genocide by the United Nations. It is certainly the case that Meta is quite bad at moderating its platforms in especially the global south, especially in languages that don't use the Roman alphabet, for example. But it's also the case that Meta has like a really complicated content moderation system that is different in every country. It's like Germany has very specific anti-Nazi laws in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and Meta complies with all of those rules. And you cannot say things in Germany that you can say on other parts of Facebook and in other parts of the world. So I think that these content moderation changes have an audience of one. And I think it's Donald Trump, like, honestly.
No, that makes a ton of sense. So, will we pivot to our final few stories?
We actually have two stories right off the top that I'm curious in getting your thoughts on. The first is kind of a logical segue. Again, a lot sort of in an effort to sort of strengthen or build a bridge out of these sort of monopolistic social media companies. There was this effort that sort of was announced this week, Free Our Feeds. Did you see that? I'm sure you saw it coming through. Yeah, and basically it's trying to, I guess, strengthen, the tech that Blue Sky is built on, the AT protocol, which is basically the idea is so that you can kind of talk to other protocols or other networks, if I'm not mistaken. It builds out the tech that allows you to maintain your audience if you want to go somewhere else, and sort of it's related to the federation that's done at Mastodon as well. It's just an effort to decentralize some of the social networks that everybody uses. A lot of big names associated with it. There's Eli Pariser, who wrote The Filter Bubble a while back. Cory Doctorow is aligned with that. Folks from Mozilla. What do you think of this?
I think it's very cool. I think it's very exciting. I think that it's not the only effort that is sort of existing to both like further decentralize Blue Sky, but also to make all of these decentralized social media platforms a little more usable, a little more interoperable. I haven't written this article yet, and I did the interview weeks ago, but there's another group called A New Social that is working to strengthen the bridge between Mastodon and Blue Sky. And, there's some amount of money behind that. But basically, it's like, I think that making these platforms easier to join, less tied to venture capital, less tied to like less centralized, but still very usable is absolutely critical.
Right. Because like one of the big knocks on Blue Sky is that like it does have some venture capital backing it up. Some blockchain capital is like the name of the ominously named sort of fund that invested in it. Cory Doctorow famously won't join Blue Sky because it's not interoperable enough. So he's sort of one of the folks who's backing this up along with a long list of others.
Probably all three of us are friends with Cory, have a ton of respect for Cory, but I saw him over on Mastodon saying that like if this works, he'll be happy to join the Blue Sky party. And in my mind, it's like this entire thing was launched just so that Cory can give himself permission to join Blue Sky.
I think so. Yeah.
Well, he's not even one of the main guys though on here.
I know.
I think it's like an interesting effort, but like I feel like I'm so skeptical of these kinds of things. You have these big organizations making this big launch. We're talking on Wednesday, it's raised less than $50,000 of the $4 million goal that it has to try to do something here. Some of the people behind it are starting to use some weird language to try to push people to donate more money. I'm just skeptical that like this kind of a movement is what actually creates some sort of real alternative to get people off of like these major centralized platforms that are easy to use and that a lot of people go to. And I think that if there's ever going to be success with that, like there's going to need to be government support behind it somewhere because they have far more resources than anyone else.
Yeah, there needs to be politics too. Yeah, I like the effort. I think it's cool. And I very much hope that they succeed in building out their technology. But I do also think that you're 100% right. We also just need to start thinking about like what does like a politics of like a democratic sort of online existence look like what's the political component here, like how do we actually ensure this free? I mean, we can give people various technical tools, and that's cool. And we can build services like Blue Sky that people really like. But I think you're right. In order to actually protect them, we need like new ways of like building more durable coalitions, more durable like democratic institutions that actually can, service these platforms and products that, rather than either having them, beholden to a billionaire on one end, or like working with like a sort of an incomprehensible set of protocols that only the most technical people can understand on the other.
There are any number of startup, like nonprofit type things like this for any number of tech issues. It's like there's the anti AI detection ones, there's the like watermarking systems that, are not actually being used. And I think that the people who have signed on to this are credible, serious people. I don't know whether this one in particular goes anywhere. And I will say that there's a lot of other like open source projects, nonprofit projects, blah, 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 that say like, we're going to work to solve XYZ problem. And then you never hear about them ever again. Many of them get a lot of funding from, different larger nonprofit organizations, and then never really like actually make much of a dent. I think that the problem that they're trying to solve in this case, though, feels very solvable to me, where it's like you can further decentralize Blue Sky and you can make Mastodon and Blue Sky way more interoperable. Hopefully, no user will ever hear about this company or think about it or anything. Like, it has to be seamless. And I think what we've seen with the success of Blue Sky, which still has a long, long way to go, is that it's only going to work if the users are there, and it's only going to work if they're easy to use. And like the only reason that I am still on Blue Sky and I love it, I'm having a good time, is because the people that I want to follow are there. And I think for Twitter, there were a couple like really clear moments where Elon Musk did something crazy and bad, and a bunch of people moved over, and there was like these different moments where there was, an accelerant. And for something like TikTok, like a TikTok alternative that is not Instagram Reels or an Instagram alternative, I think it's a way harder thing, because Twitter was a lot of journalists and scientists and nonprofits and people who are like inclined to use this sort of technology. Can I get my mom on an Instagram alternative? I don't know. I think it's a lot harder.
Right.
Yeah.
And and just to be clear, like, more power to everybody who's trying to build alternatives out there. God bless you. Godspeed. I wish you all the success. It's great. I think another thing that we do need to be thinking about is ways to like, build the power that can move some needles. There are some groups who work for like, digital rights and stuff, and the EFF and Fight for the Future. They do some work in some very specific spheres, but they have a very specific political ideology. I think, there needs to be more sort of digital movements that are like truly fighting for a democratic, worker-friendly, user-friendly sort of social force on the internet.
And I would say I hope that, the Trump moment finally pushes people in other countries to think a lot more about that, right? I don't think that that is going to come from the United States necessarily. I think my hope is more beyond the United States. And, we talked last year about this white paper that I wrote around digital sovereignty. Some of my co-authors on that were at the European Parliament earlier this week, talking to members of the European Parliament about it. Some other academics and researchers and things are working on another proposal around building a Euro stack that is already gaining traction in Europe. So, I think that there are opportunities here. They just need to be seized, and governments need to recognize that this is actually something important that needs to be worked on and done, to put real incentives behind building this alternative, more democratic tech ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think you're both right that now, if it's going to happen, like now when we see this absurd centralization, the absurd sort of power wielding, and the concentration of wealth and influence of just a handful of guys who are now dictating not just social media, but essentially the entire internet. So now's the time to push back. So we've already gone kind of long, but Jason, quickly, if you could, we saw you tweeting about the news that the U.S. government is suing John Deere.
Or skeeting, rather.
Yeah, skeeting, right, on Blue Sky. But this has been another sort of area of interest of yours for just about as long as I've known you.
Yeah, so for people who are unaware, John Deere tractors are really hard to repair, and that's for a very specific reason, which is many of them have ECUs in them now, which are essentially sensors that require a replacement part to be essentially activated by John Deere. And so you have all these farmers who have worked on these family farms for generations, who their dad and their grandpa and their grandma were repairing tractors forever, who suddenly are unable to do so because of these sort of like arbitrary software locks pushed by John Deere. And this has been a big thing for a long time, part of the right to repair movement. And there's been increasing scrutiny on Deere for this monopolization of tractor repair over the last few years. There was a class action lawsuit that's still going on that the Department of Justice actually weighed in on and said, like, hey, we think that there's a there. The FTC had done a few reports on it. There's been a lot of like state legislation. It's just been like a big rallying cry for a long time. And then this week, the FTC and Lena Khan formally sued John Deere, saying like, this is a monopoly and an illegal one at that. Biden has 4 more days in office. This is not going to get adjudicated in that time.
Does this die because it's a Biden thing, or does it survive because there's enough pro-Trump farmers that hate it?
I have no idea. But I think of any sort of like tech regulation, this has one of the, or, legal action, this has one of the biggest chances of making it through a Trump administration as well, because many farmers are Republicans. Right to repair in general, it does bridge the divide between, it's pretty bipartisan, about as bipartisan as anything these days. And a lot of like state level legislation has been passed in largely Republican states, as well as Democratic states as well. But it's usually passes by like 99-1 when they ultimately like get past the tech lobbyists who manage to kill it in the short term. So I don't know what's going to happen here necessarily. It's very possible that it falls by the wayside, but also the state of Minnesota and Illinois attorneys general are part of this lawsuit. So it's possible that if the FTC drops it, those states continue on anyway. I'll just say it's a big deal just because it's the most forceful thing that the federal government has done regarding repair, like against any company. So it's pretty interesting. Again, last 4 days of the Biden administration, so we'll see, but pretty notable.
Yeah, I thought it was a cool story.
Yeah, it is. And right to repair has always been this like small sort of like source of like optimism that like there can be at least small levels of progress, and right to repair laws have passed in a number of states around the.
People should be able to repair their tractors.
People should be able to repair their stuff.
Yeah.
Once it's articulated, in public, it's pretty hard to defend like that statement. If you buy something, you should be able to fix it.
Yeah.
It's really one of the only like good news stories that has occurred in all of tech over the last few years, where there's been like considerable progress. And it's because of this sort of like iterative like state legislation and little things like this over and over again.
Yeah. To pivot quickly to the bad news again, just very quickly, the UK has made waves because it has announced a new plan in which artificial intelligence will be, quote, mainlined into the veins of the nation, as ministers have announced. Their words, like, that's not a critic talking about it. That is how they're describing what they want to do. It's this so-called sweeping action plan to increase 20-fold the amount of AI computing power under public control in the UK. And a lot of this stuff is just pretty, a boilerplate. It's more investment. It's just making it sort of just AI just easier for British companies to sink their teeth into. But there's one major provision that has everyone up in arms, 100% rightfully so, and that is that it would ease or eliminate outright sort of any copyright claims on works that can be ingested into AI systems. So British artists and writers and creators are quite justifiably furious as they're pushing. And this is a Labour plan. So the UK Labour is somewhat analogous to the Democrats in the US. It's the left liberal party. And they are just basically saying we're going to open the floodgates to AI. And as of right now, if you're an artist that is worried about having your stuff ripped off and then made to compete with you, too bad, get in line. And then Paris, you want to do the last headline?
Yeah, it's a terrible story. And of course, one of the big concerns there too is the UK government is pushing ahead with a bunch of new massive data centers and the water costs, not to mention the energy costs that are going to come with that. And of course, that's related to the final story that we wanted to talk about, which is the Biden administration, once again in its final days has brought forward this executive order to speed the construction of artificial intelligence data centers. And of course, to bolster national security in doing that, because it's always about national security. But again, I think that this is prompting a lot of serious concerns on the one hand about how, we're just buying this whole push from the tech industry that AI is going to be the next big thing and we need to dedicate all these resources to it, but also about trying to speed up this construction and using federal land to do it specifically for gigawatt scale AI data centers means that a lot of the kind of checks and balances there are basically going to go out the window because we all want to jump on what the tech industry wants the future to be, where all the growth and investment is going now. And I think obviously we can see with the Trump administration that it's going to be full steam ahead on these sorts of things, but do we really need the Biden administration kind of setting up the foundation for all this right before they leave office? So yeah, plenty of huge concerns with that.
Yeah, and it's something I meant to say earlier, but pulling out the China strand there, I hope our listeners will check out Jason's story about how Facebook used this canard of China being this looming evil competitor, this new sort of wave of xenophobia that's now very much in vogue. But it's the same thing that the AI companies are doing, right? To justify more data centers, more investment. In some cases, their very reason for being, they say, well, if you don't, clear the way for us, if you don't, regulate us with a light hand or not at all, then China's going to eat our lunch. And, there's all these ominous undertones.
We can't let our AI agents be Chinese.
But the fact that Zuckerberg's doing the same thing for social media, it should raise everybody's eyebrows. It's almost like a one-size-fits-all sort of argument. Well, China.
I told my fiance last night that I'm working on this story. She writes about China. And she's like, well, what about the car companies? Chinese cars are basically banned. The U.S. government has already done it for Chinese cars. Yeah. They've already done it for, the AI tech, et cetera. And so, yep. I mean, the interesting thing with social media is that TikTok is popular already in the United States, whereas a lot of these Chinese cars have not been here. Chinese AI tech is not super integrated into U.S. society already.
I think these are a bunch of other topics that we'll be picking up on future episodes as all these things continue to be discussed. Jason, thanks so much for joining us and being one of our first guests. Really appreciate it.
Jason, thank you for blasting a torrent of insights into our faces and into our listeners' ears. 404 Media, if you are not already reading
and listening to the podcast.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. This was wonderful. And my favorite thing to do is yammer on for a really long time.
Well, then you've come to the right place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good luck with the wildfires. I'm sure I'll see you in our smoggy dystopia soon.
System Crash is hosted by Paris Marks and Brian Merchant. Production is by Eric Wickham. Our theme music is Dystopia by our good friends in Yacht. Support the show on patreon.com/systemcrashpod to get a monthly bonus episode.
Bye.